It's 1:30, and I'm going to welcome you to this event. There are a few housekeeping points to make, and I'm hoping that you probably had the message as well, but if you haven't, just to say that apart from the panelists, everyone's microphone is on mute, but if you can put your camera on and keep it on, that would be great. And if you do want to raise questions for the panel, it would be excellent if you could put that in the chat, and my colleague Chris Holmes will pick those up. So it's a great pleasure to have been asked to host the conference today. People are joining. I'm watching lots of messages on one side of my screen as more and more people are joining, and we're already up to about 50 here. And I think there may be more coming. If I can just tell you what to expect, it's a fairly short event, but it's absolutely focused on celebrating the listener scheme, which started 30 years ago. And you're going to hear quite a lot about how and why it started. You're going to see a film which has been made by Blackburn, well, supported by Blackburn and Macclesfield Samaritans. And you will hear from people on the panel ranging from academics to people with lived experience, people with experience of volunteering for the Samaritans, and people supporting staff who in turn support listeners. So it's a great array of people, but a sensible amount of time toward the end has been put over to questions and answers. So just to start us off, to say why I am particularly keen, was particularly pleased to be asked to host the event. And I think that's for two reasons, really. One is because I admire and value the work that Samaritan Listeners do. And for years of involvement with prisons, one way or another, I've always made a point of trying to see whether I can meet teams of listeners when I visit prisons. I find that those people often have the greatest insight into what's happening in their establishment. They're aware of the vulnerabilities of people who are held there, and they can talk really cogently about the work they're doing to prevent deaths in custody. And that brings me to a second reason, which is my role now as chair of the Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody. From the panel, we all appreciate and value the work the Samaritan Listeners do. We've been concerned over lockdown periods during the pandemic about whether Samaritans could function, whether they were getting the support they needed. And we're pleased to hear that where support had dropped away, things are being built up again now. I think the third is a completely personal reason, and that is that Kathy Bigger, who started the scheme after the very sad death of a 15-year-old boy in Swansea prison back in 1991. When Kathy started the scheme, we didn't know each other, but we met soon afterwards, and we were firm and fast friends for the rest of her life. Many people who knew Kathy will know that she did die 3 years ago. She was the most remarkable, compassionate and kind person who, together with the then governor at Swansea, really developed something which is gold dust, I think is the right word for it. I'll read you what a prisoner wrote to us at the IAPDC, and you can see what sometimes people say. This is what one man told us. He wrote from Inside Time, the prisoner's newspaper. He said, in my opinion, and no doubt that of many others, the inception of the listeners scheme in Swansea prison in 1992 is probably the best thing to have ever happened in prison. I would suggest that thousands of lives have been saved in that time, and I'm sure that he's right. So I will come in and out during this, and I will enjoy staying with you and listening to the film, learning from the panelists, and opening up for questions and answers. But it's time now to turn to the film, and you'll see that it's about 10 minutes, and I hope that you'll appreciate it.
When I first got into prison, I noticed there was a lot of self-harm and a lot of people that were at a desperate level where they wanted to take their own lives.
Self-harm and suicide within a prison setting is one of the most difficult things that we deal with on a daily basis, particularly staff. It's a complex area, so a lot of individuals come into custody with mental health problems as well as some family issues.
Samaritans started thinking about how it could reach high-risk groups in the 1980s. At the same time, there was growing concern about the suicides in prisons. In 1991, there were 2 suicides in HMP Swansea. One of those was a suicide of a 15-year-old boy. He was on remand in prison for stealing a handbag. In response, Samaritans in the prison service agreed to pilot an intervention to reduce suicide. The prison put forward 6 people, and 3 of those were trained to be listeners, and they called themselves the Swansea Listeners, and that's how the listener scheme began.
All you're there to do is to be an ear and to listen. If someone says to you, I don't want to go on, I want to end my life, the natural reaction is, mate, what are you talking about? You know, you've got your kids and your mum, what your friends going to say? People love you, why? And a listener will say, okay, that's a horrible place to be. How long have you been feeling like that?
The skills of being a good listener are so multifaceted. The most important thing is having empathy, being able to listen, to be compassionate but distant. It's a very difficult job, and having been in this role for a long time, but also in the prison service for a long time, you can see when listeners are at their best, they're showing that resilience, that emotional intelligence, the ability to care, the ability to think through problems with people and to set them on the right path in terms of not harming themselves or thinking about self-inflicting death.
So to have somebody that they can talk to, that they can open up to, might be the thing that stops them from thinking about self-harm or thinking that there is no point in going on with their life. That somebody is willing to listen to them can make a huge change to somebody and really appreciate that, hang on, somebody's prepared to take their time and listen to what I've got to say or want to explore how I'm feeling. That's invaluable.
The listener scheme has had such a huge impact over the last 30 years. It's grown from being just in HMP Swansea to being in prisons across the UK and Ireland. We have at any one time 1,500 listeners providing emotional support to their peers day in, day out. In any one year we could have approximately 50,000 listener contacts. So that's every time somebody is asking for emotional support from a listener.
I think one of the pinnacle moments for me was we had a call and it was so hard. We managed to hold it together throughout the call and not react to what was happening around us, what people were saying. And at the end, we went back to the wing. An hour and a half later, the officer come to our cell and said that the person that we'd gone to see had called for the officer to come, and they'd said that we'd saved their life that night. And they wanted the officer to come and tell us that they were fine, and they wanted us to know that and to go to sleep and be happy with what we'd done.
There was one prisoner that sticks out for me really, because he was a prolific self-harmer. He'd served a sentence for about 10 years, and every prison that he'd gone in, he was harming himself. We, with the listeners, sat down and tried to work out a plan for him. There was one particular time I was walking in the prison grounds and saw him outside and had a conversation with him, because he hadn't harmed himself for a good month or so. And I was talking to him and said, so what is it? What's happened? What's changed? And he said, one of the listeners. I thought, and knowing that there was a good number of listeners in the prison, I thought, well, that's good that he's got a good relationship with one. Why one listener? He said, he reminds me of my father. And it turned out that he'd lost his father just before coming into custody, and he'd never really spoken about it. So part of the self-harming was because that he'd lost a family member before coming into custody. That's the power of the listener scheme, when you have someone like that can tap into the thoughts and relationships, and that's really important.
I was visiting a women's prison, and the listeners there wanted to show us a listener support room where they provide support. And as we were going to look at the support room, a lady approached me in the corridor and she said, "Are you with Samaritans?" I said, "Yes, I am with Samaritans." And she said, "I just want to tell you that the listeners here saved my life. They do an amazing job." And I was so touched by that. She went on to explain that on her first night in prison, she'd been beside herself. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how she was going to cope. And she just couldn't see a future. She said that a listener had come and sat with her and listened and just provided that support that she needed. And thanks to that listener, she was still with us. It gave me goosebumps at the time, and it still gives me goosebumps today. I think that really shows the impact of the scheme.
When I'm a volunteer at Samaritans, I always offload whatever I've done, whoever I've listened to another volunteer, so that it doesn't weigh on you. And that's basically what we're there for within the prison support team, that we're there to support those listeners, because essentially they're doing our job inside the 4 prison walls.
They are the most incredible, funny, compassionate, non-judgmental people I have ever known, and it's a great privilege to work with them.
Every single time we do it, I come out of it knowing that a few of those people will turn their lives around. There was an award ceremony where we give out the certificates to show that they've finished the training, and that was done in the chapel, and that would be done with their wives or their lovers or their family or their kids. And this guy was probably my age, like mid to late 50s. He said to me, he said, "Mate," he said, "this is the first certificate I've ever had. It's the first thing I've ever passed. It's the first time I've ever been applauded." And he was 55 years old. And I found that really moving, and just like, I realised this guy hadn't had many opportunities to show the qualities he has, and he's a really successful listener. And you can see his shoulders go back. You can see the pride he takes in it. So it's great for him. It's great for the people on his wing who he goes to nightly and helps.
We had one particular guy who was on an IPP sentence, which means that he was, even if he was released, it would be on licence for the rest of his life. And he went in with an 18-month sentence and came out after 10.5 years. And in that time, he changed dramatically through being a listener. And he is now currently doing a degree at university, is back in contact with his children and his wider family, and doing really well.
There's a lot of inhumanity, there's a lot of things that shouldn't be happening, but there is also light. And I think the Samaritans coming in and training listeners and bringing that light in, that changes things.
So the scheme's been operating 30 years. I think it's more important today than it was 30 years ago because of the level and complexity of self-harm that's happening in our prisons, and because the level of mental health that individuals come into custody with. It's grown significantly over that period of time, and it's operating everywhere in our prisons. These things grow, and I continue to have faith in the fact that we will continue to invest in the Samaritans, that we will continue to have listeners operating in our prisons, that will continue to make a difference on a day-to-day basis to those in custody.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for rescuing the technology, everyone's nightmare. And I'm very glad that people were able to see that film and get a sense of what Samaritans are doing. I probably should say now that I know that we're not as diverse a group as the Samaritans are in prisons and establishments. It's important to say that in terms of both age and race. And so just take that as a caveat if you would, and it may well come up in the Q&A later on. I've got great pleasure in introducing the panelists to you. They're a very fabulous group of people, ranging from a very well-known academic to a person with experience of working as a Samaritan listener, someone who is leading for the Samaritans on support in prisons, and a person who's leading in Wales on support for staff. So I think they're an excellent panel. Each person will contribute, but leave time for you to ask questions, and we'll take the questions at the end, and then I'll do my best to sum up. But I think, you know, it's a hard thing to sum up, because actually it's a very good thing. It's not bad news, it's extremely good news. People doing very good things in very difficult circumstances, and doing them for the right reasons. So no more ado, I'm going to start with Karen Slade, Professor Karen Slade. And I'm waiting to see Karen. I think she will appear.
I am here.
Very good. I'm
Hiding.
hoping that I shall see you kind of front and centre of the screen in a minute. Karen, it's terrific that you're here. Karen's a professor of applied forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University, and Karen also is the strategic lead for deaths under supervision for the Prison and Probation Service. So she's been pioneering work recently with probation staff to help them prevent deaths in custody. You can see why our panel is very pleased to be connected to Karen and to this event. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. I'm hoping there might be some slides somewhere appearing very shortly by somebody, but while they appear, I just want to say how pleased I am to be able to support this event. I've worked with many hats on with the listeners and the Samaritans over the last 20 or 25 years, and have always been awed by the dedication and general wonderfulness, to be honest, of the listeners and the Samaritans. I have many stories to tell, as I'm sure have we all, about individuals and in general. So I'm very pleased to be able to do a little bit today. I've been asked to do, hopefully, a very much a whistle-stop 10-minute overview, really, around why it's a priority, I suppose, that we continue to do and prioritise work around suicide and self-harm, and something around the links between suicide and self-harm behaviour, a little about who's involved, and what's involved with that, and a little about what we know about what works, and specifically looking at the listeners' scheme. Aha, there they are. Wonderful, thank you. So in terms of who I am, as I said, I have a bit of a two hats, in the sense of I'm a professor at university who specialises in suicide and self-harm prevention over many years, but also I'm currently leading some work around deaths under supervision in the community. So yes, please, next slide, please, with my best Chris Whitty hat on. I've got a little mug as well I could have brought along. In terms of just thinking initially here around why it remains such an important priority to around suicide prevention within prisons, this slide is taken from data from our official data that we produce every year around how many people are dying apparently from suicide within prison. This is sort of the rate rather than the overall numbers. And what it kind of shows is that on average, around 1 in every 1,000 people die each year, and that might not sound like very much when you sort of put it like that, but we know it's like 9 or 10 times more than those people who are outside in the general population. And that figure, although thankfully is coming down, and we've had some very high numbers in previous years, it still remains high, and we can get that much lower. Next slide, please. We also know that self-harm, as Andy Rogers suggested in the film that we've just watched, around self-harm has continued to be a difficult area in the work that we do within prisons. The rate of self-harm has continued largely to increase, although during the COVID pandemic we saw those numbers dip down. We'll see whether or not that trend continues and where that trend goes But we know that the complexity and the difficulties around self-harm continued to cause us difficulty, and we must remain focused on this area of work. So next slide, please. I can see a little thing moving. So feel free to open all of this one up. So in terms of whether suicide and self-harm are linked, these numbers tend to go together in the sense of the rates of self-harm and suicide. And we know that in terms of risk of suicide, we know that self-harm is the single most reliable risk factor for suicide. And what I mean by that is that we know that about near enough half of all people who sadly take their life by suicide have a history of previous self-harm or attempted suicide, although equally half of them don't, which means that it's not necessary or sufficient, and we need to bear that in mind as well. They're not that well linked. And we also know in a prison setting, around half of people who die have an incident quite close to their death. So again, it's a good indicator that we need to respond to that self-harm behaviour when we're thinking about suicide prevention. Connected to that is that in the community, when someone has ever used more lethal methods of self-harm, they remain throughout their lives at higher risk of suicide. So again, we can't become complacent about thinking that things are short-lived and that people remain at risk for extended periods of time, and we need to continue to work with people. Other pieces of information that we know from some of the research is that in prisons, females particularly who self-harm multiple times, and numbers have been suggested about over 5, are at significantly higher risk of dying by suicide in prison. So we need to have special services and responsive services for people who have repetitive self-harm. We also know that the at-risk groups that we often see are very similar between self-harm and suicide, which on my next slide, please, I'll just touch upon. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about these risk groups, but we know that generally speaking, people are highly vulnerable within prisons. There is very likely that an awful lot of people will have one or more of these risk groups. So this includes, as I've mentioned already, prior self-harm or suicidal behaviour is very prevalent, but also misuse of alcohol and drugs, particularly psychotropic drugs, prior or current psychiatric or mental health disorders or treatment needs. We also often talk about first-timers in prison, who are clearly an important group, but also prior incarcerations and repeated people who've been in prison. We need to focus on, because actually they are high risk. And I'm just going to touch upon these last 3 because these things, in some respects, we have, I think, a little more control over than some of these. So about support groups. And the need to provide good support for people. A lot of people might have severe lack of support, and we need to think about how we can provide that in the way that work meets their needs. Often people have a history of trauma, abuse, neglect, and other adverse life events, which we need to respond to appropriately within the prison environment. And then finally, we know from the sort of theoretical research around suicide and self-harm that a sense of feeling defeated and trapped and unable to kind of move forward and to progress and a lack of control have a really strong risk for both suicide and self-harm. And these things are things that potentially lots of these things are things that we can help people with while they're inside prison. Okay, next slide, please. But I've talked there about how they're similar, but I don't want to give the impression that I think they're the same thing by any means, because there are massively important differences between them. And this is about why somebody might self-harm or feel suicidal, but also then how we support them. I'm not going to go into lots of detail. In 10 minutes, I could be here all day talking about that, as I'm sure can you. And I'm just touching here around, this is a box of things that's actually in a guide that we produced about 18 months ago, that's available from prisons and probation staff around some of the reasons why people might self-harm. And it's about trying to encourage a slightly broader, understanding, and I think that's important, around thinking around understanding the individual understanding around self-harm. That self-harm might be about feeling alive or wanting to feel alive rather than actually wanting to die. That control or communication or needing to get rid of bad feelings is actually what's going on behind self-harm. But also that suicide is not always about wanting to die. It might be just a deep need escape or relief from something that feels unbearable. And these things are aspects that we can work with and support if we can gain access to those individuals if they come forward and provide that support. So next slide, please. Now those factors are kind of all about the individual, and those who know me, I have a big thing about it's like this isn't about an individual in isolation. The prison experience matters. It's how people are interacting with it, and these things we absolutely have much more control over about how people are responding. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but we know, for instance, that there are certain factors that cross over the self-harm and suicide prison experience. So things around being isolated, which in self-harm seems to be more about placement in kind of isolation, and that could include basic regime for when we were having that. For suicide, we know that single cells and segregation are particularly important factors that we need to be really mindful of, but also the timings in somebody's journey. So the research suggests that for suicide, those early days and weeks of custody, the coming up for release, and then the early weeks of post-release. But for self-harm, sometimes it seems to come slightly later after imprisonment. It peaks sometimes the first incident, first 1 to 3 months after. So we need to be sure that we don't just focus all our efforts in one place, that we continue to provide support. And also around exposure to behaviours of others. We know that within prison, most people in the community are not seeing the self-harm and suicidal behaviours of others. And in prison, it's very difficult to avoid that. And we need to be able to respond to understanding that we have that people are doing that and provide support. And then finally, around things like bullying. And responding appropriately to that for both the victims and those who feel they need to engage in that behaviour within prisons. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to finish with thinking about the benefits of peer support. I feel like I've said lots of negative things there about the sort of bad picture, but we have some real benefits about our peer support. I'm not going to go into it. You probably all experience it. You kind of know some of this stuff from your own experience, but we know from the research that suggests that peer support can really help men and women in prison to do things like venting their frustrations, about being able to express those feelings, and it helps them to improve a sense of calm and control, reducing feelings of isolation, supporting that adjustment to prison life in a more positive way, providing positive role modelling, and then promoting healthier lifestyles for people. Some of the strongest evidence has come from about being a peer supporter and the enhancement of confidence, purpose, self-esteem. That ability to self-reflect and improving their sense of self-efficacy, the improvement in communication and organisational skills, and the generation of positive self-image. And I was struck by Andy Rogers' story there again around the listener, pulling their shoulders back and having the certificate, and that idea that there are benefits in many ways for peer support schemes. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch upon a piece of research that was done a couple of years ago by Dr. Liz Scowcroft, who works in the Samaritans, around evaluating the listener scheme. I'm not going to talk about all of it, there's lots of great stuff in it, but I'm just going to touch upon a couple of things that struck me about what she found. Thank you. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll just pull up all of the pieces of it. There's 4. What she was finding, the study looked at lots of different prisons, hundreds and hundreds of different individuals, and they were reporting around a quarter of men and women in prison had self-harmed at some point whilst in prison, and over a third had self-harmed at some point in their life, and that's a very large number of people who compared to people in the general population. And more critically, I think, is that about a third had reported experiencing suicidal thoughts, but about 1 in 7 reported having attempted suicide at some stage whilst in prison, and that is a significantly high number. Thank you. Next slide, please. So it's really important that we make sure that we ask the right question of saying, is the listener scheme getting to the right people? And what she found was the answer to that was absolutely yes, it was. And this was a really good endorsement, I think, of saying it's not just that we have a scheme, but the scheme is getting to the right people. Now, what this graph is saying along the bottom is there was various factors that we know are indicators of high suicide risk, and this is feeling defeated, feeling trapped, feeling hopeless, current suicidality, current self-harm, being an act. And in all of those cases, significantly more people who were experiencing that were accessing the listener scheme at that time, and that was far more than people who were not feeling that way. I thought it was a really great endorsement of the fact the listeners have the reputation and are meeting the needs of those individuals at the right time and the right people. So next slide, please. So, so you can put all this one on as well. So in summary, my last slide is the listener scheme from this much larger study. It was reaching the right people at the right time and in the right way. They also reported not only that it was that, but they wanted to keep going back. So it was meeting their needs, and that is a great endorsement. And also, not only were they reporting this, but actually not that I'm sort of say that research evidence matters more, but we also were able to show that it made a difference on a number of factors that in terms of actually accessing the listener scheme makes a real difference to people. But picking up some points from that video again around, we need to make sure that peer support and the listener scheme works in collaboration. It can't solve all of the problems, and this study, and we very much know that, and I'm sure this is very much your experience, it must be in a much wider package of support that's available for the men and women in prison, both practical, emotional, mental health, etc. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Juliet, and I shall be there for the panel Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much. And a reminder to everyone here, and there are about 70 people here, you're all very skilled, I think, and know a lot about this, but you also will have questions, and don't forget to put those in the chat. The next member of the panel is Lewis Gibson, who is a former listener. I'm very grateful to Lewis, who's recently contributed to a prison radio programme called SAFE that we made with the IAPDC to try and help people restore confidence as they begin to emerge painstakingly from that dreadfully long period of excessive lockdown. So I've got my own thanks to give to him, but I also want to thank Lewis for being here, for being prepared to talk about his experiences at Winchester, and also to talk about the ways in which he knows he's helped people and the way in which being a listener has affected him. So Lewis, if I could hand over to you, that would be great.
Thank you. Right, so there's a lot to fit in there really in the 5-minute time that I've been given, but
Take a bit longer.
I'll do my best. Yeah, okay. So yeah, basically, I had no idea when I applied to be a listener, you know, what an impact it was going to have on my life. I'll be honest, I applied to be a listener because somebody told me that they put you on hold in HMP Winchester and it stopped you getting moved to another prison. Do you know what I mean? And so I signed straight up for it, and I was selected. But the course is amazing. The 6-week course you do, and the things you learn on there, you know, you think you listen to people, but until you're actually taught that you don't actually listen to people, you know, and they teach you different techniques of, you know, speaking to people. And a lot of the time, you know, what I learned is at first, when I first started being a listener and I was shadowed by like a more experienced listener and that I'd really want to say something when the person came in and spoke to me. But what I found when I became a listener was that generally that's your job, yeah, to listen, you know. And you know, I found that if I paused for a little bit longer than I usually would when I'm having a conversation with somebody, that generally a person would open up more. You know, if I just took that, gave them that extra little bit of time, as opposed to like trying to placate them or, you know, talk to them about what their problem was and that, you know. So yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely very rewarding and very difficult at times. The most difficult thing is like what you're taught on the course is that, you know, if somebody tells you that they want to end their life, you can't just tell the officers, you know, you got to respect their wishes, and that's the most difficult thing about the job, really. You know, if someone's adamant that they're going to commit suicide and then you leave them, you know, you can't turn around to the officer and say, oh, look, by the way, so and so said he's going to commit suicide. You know, you've got to just respect their confidentiality, you know, and go back to your cell. And I've spent a lot of nights here like worrying about people that I've been speaking to and that, you know. But the other side of it is, you know, like being taught on the course to explore people's feelings instead of saying, like, everyone, I think it's like a general thing everyone says, you know, if someone says they're gonna commit suicide, you say don't do anything silly. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And they kind of taught us, you know, that there's nothing silly about people wanting to commit suicide. Do you know what I mean? That's how they feel. And just kind of empathizing with them or asking them, exploring why they feel like that. Do you know what I mean? And kind of going down that avenue. And I've had lots of experiences where people have, you know, came in and told me they've literally been in their cell about to do something, you know, and then I've sat down with them and kind of listened to them and spoke with them and explored how they feel. And then like they've left me like smiling from ear to ear and saying thank you, you know, like I feel so much better now and that, and that's just amazing. Do you know what I mean? To I kind of started trying to explore, because a lot of people I spoke to, prisoners I spoke to, like they had like a really negative view of themselves and that, and but kind of explore the good things in their life. Do you know what I mean? And then like kind of reinforce it in the conversation and that, to try and give them a sense of self-worth before they left me. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I kind of really got into the role, really. And so I got self-worth from doing it. I definitely learned a lot about myself. I've come from a place of like, you know, being in addiction. I've had struggles with addiction in the past and that, and kind of being the center of my own universe and everything being about me, and listening, like being on call and going out and listening to people and their problems, and kind of realizing, you know, that my problems may not be necessarily as bad as a lot more people's problems out there. You know, it's kind of humbling. And yeah, it definitely gave me more empathy, a better understanding of people, and maybe where I would have been really dismissive of other people's feelings in the past, you know, you know, and I used to be like that, I'll admit it. You know, I'd be like, because that's the kind of tough macho image in prison. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, if anyone shows any weakness, it's like, oh, shut up, mate. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and like, oh, look at him, you know, he's weak or whatever, or, you know, he just. And I kind of went from that to actually sitting there. And I remember clearly thinking to myself when people are talking to me about their problems, thinking like, wow, do you know what I mean? Like, this is a real person here, yeah, and he actually really feels like this. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, this problem to me that he's talking about seems really insignificant, yeah, but to him it's really massive. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and like, it just really opened my mind and opened my eyes and that, yeah, to like how other people feel and that, and other people's needs, and you know how other people cope with things and that. And yeah, I was proud to be a listener, very proud to be a listener, and yeah, it gave me a sense of purpose in prison. And yeah, I used to pray every day for someone to be sent for me to help. Do you know what I mean? And you know, I'd never say no. They could come and knock on my officer, could come and knock on my door any time of day or night and say, Lewis, will you? Even if I was asleep and they woke me up, I'd be like, yeah, give me 5 minutes. Do you know what I mean? Because I just thought, you know, like someone needs my help in it. Someone needs someone to talk to and that. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Lewis, thank you. That was really gave us a lot of insight, and you were very generous to do that. I'm hoping you're staying on for the panel. Questions are already coming up in the chat that I think you could help answer.
That's all right. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. And that means we turn now to Fran de Champneuf, who's the lead for prison support at the Samaritans, the functional lead. Fran, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so good afternoon to you all. Yeah, I'm Fran, and I volunteer with the prison team that goes into the Mount in Hertfordshire, which is a Cat C resettlement prison. The role of the volunteer prison team is to select, train and support listeners so they in turn can support their callers. We select prison volunteers for training as listeners. Prisoners volunteer for the role and are vetted by the prison for suitability. We will then have a selection day where we will interview them and look at their suitability for training. And I would say, just to take up the diverse issue, that over the years, the one thing I have found is that our listeners are very diverse and reflects the diverse nature of the prison population. Then as a team, we will train the new volunteers, now with the new Lit Core training, with the support of our current listeners, and we'll also carry out some ongoing training when time permits. We're also there to support the listeners, and this is normally done with regular face-to-face meetings with 2 volunteers, so the listeners can offload on the calls they have made. It's also a time for sharing information and discussion of any issues that may have arisen. Just to say, I was in the Mount last week and asked the listener team what they considered to be our contribution to what they do. And they felt the moral support was of great benefit, the ability to bend our ears and the flow of information between us, although they usually have much more information than we have. The meetings remind them that they are listeners despite the routine of prison life, which I thought was a really interesting point. They value the importance of team building and their community of listeners. Of course, there is the real importance of being able to offload their calls and to be able to learn from each other's listening experience. They valued their shared experience, the ongoing training which added to their knowledge, and their involvement in new listener training. But of course, most importantly of all, they valued the biscuits that we are taking every time we have a meeting. So thank you. That's roughly what we do.
Fran, thank you. That's really helpful, and I think it's beginning. The whole thing's beginning to come together as a picture of how and why and where all of this happens. And the last member of our panel, but certainly not the least, is Lucy Smith, who is the prisoner group safety lead for Wales. So I think that's all the prisons in Wales and quite possibly probation service as well. So I'll hand over to Lucy Smith.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for having me to speak on such a special occasion. As you've mentioned, the listener scheme was started in Swansea, which is one of my establishments, and I was lucky enough to attend their 30th birthday celebration on Tuesday. So as the group safety lead, my job is to support the prisons in my group with all aspects of prison safety, including preventing and reducing deaths, self-harm and violence. Part of my role involves working with our key stakeholders to make sure that we are doing all that we can to support our vision of making prisons a safer place for residents and staff. The Samaritans are definitely one of our most key stakeholders, and I was incredibly lucky when I started in Wales that I inherited a group of prisons who have cultivated and maintained really strong links with their local branches. It has been these strong relationships that have really seen us through the past 18 months. Our prison staff and Samaritans volunteers have worked hand in glove to think of ways to adapt to working during the pandemic to make sure our schemes have been able to continue. In particular in Swansea, we were one of the first establishments to resume face-to-face listener training for new recruits, as we felt it was such a key part of our safety delivery that we made it one of our priorities to get it back up and running, and it was only through the determination of both our staff and local branch that we were able to do this. So I'm often asked by staff how they can support the listener scheme in their establishments. One of the fundamental things I say is try and gain some understanding of the scheme. Speak to your listeners, speak to Samaritans volunteers and speak to safer custody staff. Much of the support staff will give is practical. Make sure that listener calls are facilitated and that they are given the appropriate time and space to do their role, but also raising awareness across the establishment of the support that listeners can provide to individuals who are in need of help. Also making sure that the listeners can access their support meetings with the Samaritans volunteers so that they have the opportunity to debrief, decompress and remain emotionally resilient to continue with the role. Staff are also key in identifying and encouraging potential listeners, informing them about how to become a listener and the benefits of doing so. I think the key part for me, though, is believing in the service, believing in the good work that is achieved every day in our establishments. As prison staff, we are naturally solution focused and we want to fix things and know what is happening on our wings and on our landings. But part of the listener service is accepting that confidentiality is key. And whilst we might not be able to solve everything, that sometimes feeling heard and listened to is enough to keep somebody safe. So I've also been asked to touch on the effect that the listener scheme has on improving safety in prisons. Quite simply, it is impossible to measure the impact of the scheme. In my world of safety and safer custody, we are so often measured by the things that don't go right, whether that's in rates of self-harm and violence or the sad number of deaths within our establishments. It is not possible for us to measure or even guess how many lives are saved each year through the work of the listeners, the Samaritans and our staff. But it is through speaking to our residents that allows me to understand how valuable it is for them to feel seen and heard, not for solutions to be offered, but for somebody to allow them the time and space to explore what is going on for them without judgment or prejudice. The listeners provide an opportunity for engagement on a level that through no fault of our own, we can't often achieve. No matter how caring and empathetic our staff are, at the end of our days, we go home. The listeners share a commonality with fellow residents. They know what it feels like to be behind that door, often separated from friends and family for long periods of time. As humans, we seek out people who have a shared experience with us. It is this shared experience and ability to connect on that level which makes the listener scheme so very special. When I think about the effect of the listeners have on safer custody, I think of one individual in particular. So when I started my job 2 years ago, I was told about one particular individual who was of serious concern in relation to self-harm behaviour and potentially ending their life. That individual is now one of the best listeners we have in one of my establishments. If anyone had said to him 2 years ago where he would be now, I think he would have laughed at us, and I think the staff probably would have laughed too. In his most difficult times, he was able to reach out to the listeners for help, and now he is able to return the favour to all those others in need. Not only was he helped by the scheme in the most literal sense, but he's now found purpose and meaning behind his own experience, which he can share with others. And to me, this is how the listener scheme can really save lives in ways we perhaps don't even imagine. Thank you.
Lucy, thank you. That was really helpful. And there are questions emerging. Now, I'm not sure whether Chris, my colleague, is going to read them out, or whether I am. Chris?
Hi. Yeah, I can. I've been taking a look at what's coming in on the chat, so we can start with them if you prefer that, as we're running slightly out over time. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right. So let me just find them. Here we go. Lewis, a lot of comments about how inspirational your 5 minutes chat were. A lot of comments about that. There's a question here which has been partially answered. Do you think that being listeners being prisoners themselves makes them more approachable than other people? There's a reply in the chat already that the uniform could be a barrier. Have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, 100%. Like people used to say that to me all the time. You know, a lot of the time, you know what I mean, prisoners will ask you, you know, is it confidential? Do you know what I mean? Or are you going to say anything to anyone about what they've said and that? You know, so you know, because if you think about it like this, yeah, like if you talk to a prison officer and say that you're thinking about hurting yourself, or you're serious about hurting yourself, you know, if they think you're serious, yeah, then the first thing they're going to do is come in your cell and take everything off you that you could hurt yourself with, which includes your TV and the cable that you're going to plug it in the wall with. Do you know what I mean? So, like, that's prisoners know this type of stuff, you know, and so they, you know, that it's obviously a concern, but they, I think once they get to trust you, you know, they get talking to you, and you know, they can see that they can trust you. But I think one of the things, that the main things is we were really hot on it with, like, all of the listeners have got like a solidarity between them, because we meet up on a weekly basis and we'll all like offload in this like weekly meeting we have. And so within that meeting every week, yeah, we kind of build a rapport with each other. And one of the things we were really hot on, obviously, is like, you know, you're not allowed to talk about what people, you know, say in the listens and that. And so if, you know, if new listeners come on board, because I was a listener for about a year, so I think there was like 2 lots of courses when whilst I was doing it. But so I think at one point one guy kind of broke someone's confidentiality, you know what I mean, and we straight away, like, you know, brought it to the attention of the staff and that, yeah, the safer custody team and that, because, you know, it's really important to us, you know, that if people are like opening up and talking about their stuff, you know, that they can feel safe and comfortable to do it. You know what I mean? So I think in answer to your question, yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. There is a question for Fran, kind of moves on slightly from what you were saying just now, Lewis. If someone is unsuccessful in applying the first time to be a listener, then can they reapply?
It will depend. If they're unsuccessful because the prison have turned them down, then I'm not sure. I'm sure they can reapply. But of course they can. Of course they can reapply. You know, things change, people move on. So yeah, of course, try again. No harm in trying again.
Okay. I'll move on. We had a couple of questions for Karen. A lot of interest in your slides and your presentation. Couple of questions which I'll bundle them up together. Your presentation, your slides, do they relate only to, in terms of the data, to England and Wales? And this is a question I'm guessing from one of the prison colleagues in the meeting, can the stats be quoted because they might be really useful for some of the communications that the prison wants to do?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. So yes, it's only in England and Wales. I didn't include, you know, the wider UK in that, although those numbers are available if people are particularly interested in the Scottish or Northern Ireland Prison Service numbers. Yeah, I'm quite happy for the slides to be shared and, you know, to use those information. If it's the information around things around the risk factors and those sorts of things, they're probably better, you know, more detailed sources of resources that are available, some of which are links in the slides, and the study at the end, Liz Scowcroft's study, I'd probably suggest contacting Liz directly, because to be honest, she's got some wonderful presentations with much more detail. I picked out a couple of key things with her permission to present today, but I think be good to maybe look at it in the round and see what else you might be able to say.
Right,
I'm sure she'd be happy to share those.
Another question in the chat for Lewis, if that's okay. You're very popular. So during your spell as a listener, how many calls might you take on average per week, and how many other listeners were at the prison that you were at?
So depends. I think depends what prison you're in, really. Like for me personally, when I first started, like I was in a Cat B local remand centre, so it's like quite a high turnover of people, and so what you find is maybe there'll be like 12 people on the course, and then they say they run 2 courses a year. Like within a very short period of time, yeah, you'll find that there's only like you and 2 other listeners in the prison. So at first, yeah, you might be on a, depending on what wing you're on, yeah, you'd be like on a night rota or a day rota. So, but when you're on call, you probably get called out at least 3 or 4 times a night. I mean, obviously, if you're in a remand centre, you get a lot of people coming through. I mean, I worked in reception for about 6 months as a listener, and so that's like a high number of calls. You know, you'd be sat in there and you get a lot of people coming in that are quite distraught, being remanded into prison. You know, and for various reasons, you know what I mean, like separation from family or argument with a girlfriend, or, you know what I mean, and things like that, or the length of prison sentence they've got. But yeah, like I say, when we got down to, it happened twice. Like the first time it happened, we got down to like 3 of us, and then after that, like COVID hit as well, and there was like people had been shipped out and they weren't doing any more courses and that. So, you know, for quite a long period of time, it was just me and a couple of other guys. And yeah, like when COVID was on, we had to do the listens through the door and that for a certain period of time, and that it made it very difficult. You know what I mean? Like you kind of just talking to someone through the side of the door and that. But yeah.
Right. Thank you. Juliet, we're kind of running a little bit up to time now. I've got a couple of submitted questions for the panel, which we could maybe possibly sort of sum up with. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's I was just checking it wasn't on mute. That's absolutely fine, Chris. We're okay. The whole thing finishes at 2:45.
Yeah.
And a couple of people have had to go, but they've left such lovely messages. I think that's fine.
Okay.
So please, yes, let's have those 2 and not leave them out.
Okay, so you were talking in your introduction about the scheme being in existence for 30 years. So there's a question for the panel about how you all think the scheme has changed since it began and how it's evolved over those 30 years. And obviously, moving into the future, what would you like to see in terms of the scheme do to improve its support that it provides into the future? So looking back, looking ahead. To the panel.
Well, I think one of the it's obvious, but one of the biggest, looking back, has been the effect of the pandemic, where, as Lewis has said, it's been very difficult for the volunteers to go in. It's been we haven't been able to train that, and the listeners have been under a very difficult regime. So I think that's had an enormous effect. We've done it different ways. We personally took phone calls from our listeners. So we worked the best we could, but it certainly made a huge difference. And I think going forward, we need to raise awareness, raise awareness of the scheme, because we've got a lot of new young officers who know very little about the scheme. And as the scheme has been, slightly quieter certainly in some prisons, we need to really look to raise awareness again about all the brilliant work that goes on, because as we've all said, it really saves lives.
Perhaps, Chris, the other thing to say is when Kathy was alive, she was endlessly innovative. And so she started Listeners in Court scheme, and she helped listeners from an open prison in the Midlands go into court and be available to people who'd been sentenced to custody, to try and simply to be available to listen to them, to particularly if they were fearful about what they might be going to encounter and feeling very desperate. I've also seen Samaritans operating now in police custody suites in Bournemouth and parts of Hampshire, and I think they operate in one area in Wales. That's not listeners, that's Samaritans themselves. But it seems to me that there's a huge scope. The centre core has always got to be the listeners and the listeners in prison custody, because that's where it's needed most. But I think there are opportunities as well for exploring where else a contribution can be made. Are there any other questions, Chris?
Yeah, there is a kind of slightly future related one that was pre-submitted to Karen. So what does the research say about supporting people when they're released from custody in terms of risk of suicide and self-harm, and how can we apply these findings to listener schemes?
Okay, that's one of those. That's quite a big question. That's fine. I think what the research tells us is that the going out of prison is not always a positive experience for everybody, and that it's really important that we provide ongoing through the gate support for people, that we acknowledge the fact that some people are going into more difficult situations, and that we need to essentially do what we do when people come into prison. We need to do some of that on the way out, before they leave, and probably after they leave as well. But also, the challenge in some respects is more difficult on the way out, because all of the other people that need to be involved are much more dispersed than they are on the way in, and it makes that a far more challenging situation to try and draw all of those individuals together. And I've forgotten the end of the question. Sorry, Chris. I've started with what? There's something about the listeners, but
yeah. So it was about what does the research say about supporting people when they're released from custody, and how can we apply these findings to the listener scheme?
Yeah, I think that, there's been some, I suppose those conversations, for me personally, I'd say it's important that we recognise that the move towards coming towards the end of a sentence or release, it's important that the listeners are as active possibly then as they are sometimes when people are coming in, and that we continue to support the scheme, but also how Samaritans and or listeners on obviously I know it doesn't work in the way in the community, can continue to support people in that transition into the community. I think it's probably the easy answer to I should say it's an easy answer, not an easy solution to the question.
Thank you. Another question for Lewis, if we've got time, Juliet. Yeah, Lewis, you're going to probably regret spending this time. You've answered a lot of questions. Thank you so much. So in the video, there was talk about the need for a greater need for the listener scheme now than maybe there was even 30 years ago. So given the rates of suicide and self-harm that we're dealing with now currently, what do you think the prison service can do differently to try and get those rates down and support people that need it?
So one thing I was aware of, yeah, that was really concerning, yeah, when I was in prison, well, for me hearing about it anyway, was that so when they're training prison officers now, and I was told about this by staff and by the Samaritan volunteers coming into prison, that they've had to cut down the length of the training course and that for new prison officers, and they're not even telling them about the listener scheme on their training course. Do you know what I mean? So you got new prison officers starting work in the prison, yeah, that have got absolutely no idea what the listener scheme's about. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that's across the board. I'm just speaking for Winchester Prison. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I think a greater awareness for prison officers about what the we actually did a presentation, me and one of the Samaritans, to like the staff, the prison officer staff meeting, monthly meeting in HMP Winchester, to kind of let them all know about about the listener scheme and everything, and how valuable it is and that, because I'm not going to stereotype and that, but like I did used to get officers coming to get me, in the middle of the night or whatever, saying, oh, sorry for my language and that, but they say, oh, it's a fucking idiot doing my head in, he's driving me around a twist, pressing his buzzer all night and that, yeah, like, or like after I'd spoke to someone maybe and that, they'd say not nice stuff. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and it's just, it's not them at fault. It's maybe just coming from a place of ignorance or not understanding. You know what I mean? How valuable the scheme actually is. Do you know what I mean? So I think if you kind of started at that point, because it is a very valuable service, and I think the prison's changed today. I mean, I was going to prison. I was in and out of prison from like the age of 15 to 38, yeah, from like 1996. So like I've experienced like the change in the prison system, you know what I mean, over them years. And so prison's a very different place today and that, and there's not so much, it's more accepted for you to speak about how you feel, I suppose, if I want to put it like that, you know what I mean, as opposed to, if you'd have, you couldn't have pressed your buzzer and asked for a listener 20 years ago, do you know what I mean? And on the landing, do you know what I mean? Yeah, you would have known about it the next day and that, yeah, like, and you probably would have got bullied for it, do you know what I mean? And now it's kind of more accepted, that people need to talk about things and that. So, I think a good place to start would just kind of be to build on that, really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. I think we'll have to stop questions there because we've got literally about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to have time to thank everybody, and thank everyone for listening, because that seems to me what the hallmark has been, that we've all been listening hard to the different perspectives that we've been presented with. We've been presented with a view of prisons that maybe we don't often see, based on empathy and kindness and compassion. I can see an action point emerging immediately, Lewis, from what you said, in terms of making certain that in the basic training for prison staff that an understanding of the listener scheme needs to be inserted or reinserted, because actually one of the problems during the pandemic is the way in which new staff, very many new staff, have come on board and haven't had the opportunity to work closely with people in prison in the way that they would have done prior to that. And we at the IAPDC are absolutely determined that the key worker schemes get up and running, that they're pivotal in preventing deaths in custody, and that all the Samaritan Listener schemes are reinstated. There's a lovely message in the chat from Maidstone to say that they've relaunched the scheme, that they were absolutely delighted to relaunch it, and they were able to invite prisoners' families as well as local Samaritans. And when we had our Keeping Safe conference just before the pandemic hit, it was one of the recommendations there that family members need to be involved as far as possible in helping to keep people safe in custody. We recommended very strongly that there should be support for the listeners and support for peer support in general, that was helping to build the right kind of culture, a positive culture. And obviously we recommended, I say obviously, but although we've been focused on custody, there needs to be a prior focus on preventative work. And even when people begin to get caught up in the justice system, looking to community sentences with treatment requirements as a way of enabling people to avoid being detained in custody. We do know the point's been made very well by Karen about the statistics. We know that the level of vulnerability of people, and you only have to look at the fact that, I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but I'll put it right before we send out a follow-up message. But it's around about 23 or 4% of men in custody who attempted suicide at some point in their lives prior to prison. 46% of women in custody have attempted suicide prior to custody, and that compares with about 6% of people in the general population. So we're asking a lot of people, we're asking a lot of staff, we're asking a lot of listeners, and we can see from today that we get so much, actually, that in terms of what's given, and yes, what's gained, and it's great to see that and hear it, and we get letters saying that to us too, that people have gained tremendously from working in a position of trust. But the fact is that people are giving in very difficult circumstances with very limited and often very bleak conditions. So I hope today's been a tribute. I hope it's encouraged people to be involved. I hope it leads to more support for the Samaritans, more support and recognition of listeners. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, panel particularly. Thank you, Samaritans, for organising, and thank you, Insights team, for hosting. It's been a very good event.
Thank you. See you all later. Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Lewis.
Bye, Lewis.
Thank you.
Karen.
Thanks, Dave.
Fran.
Thanks, Lewis.
George. Lucy.